Good evening. Good to see everybody here. We're going to be looking in, obviously, 1 Timothy chapter 5 as we continue working through Timothy. And these were things that were written to Timothy so that he would know how the church should behave itself, the house of God should behave. When we are in, well, he says that we are in the church. In verse 15 of chapter 3, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of the truth. And we've talked about all these things so far related to the work, related to the church, related to worship, related to the activities and the even the way we support the people who are in need in the church. And now we're moving on in the next section. We've already talked about elders, but he brings this up again in verses 17 through 22. And it's good for us to go over this. As I said before, when we went through in chapter 3, we went through it. The church needs elders. That's the goal that we're working toward. This is what God expects of all congregations, and I'm glad to see that this is not a congregation that is satisfied with the status quo of saying, okay, we're going to just keep doing the things we are doing. You know, I've been in places, and I've heard of other places, I've heard of several places that were efficient running things in men's business meetings, and they just decided they just don't want elders. And that's not a good place to be. What God has set up is the best. And so if we're going to emulate that, then we should. Now, that doesn't mean that we're sinning by not having an eldership. What it does mean is that we're growing to the point where we can, right? And that's the whole idea. But once we have the eldership that's established, we got to know, we need to understand what it is that we do. How is it that we respond to elders, and vice versa? What is expected of them? What is expected of us as a response? And a lot of what's the expectations can be kind of fettered out in chapter 3 when we're looking at the qualifications. That gives a lot of indication for what the elders will be doing. We can also see it in the book of Titus, some of the things that the elders are responsible for. And here really it talks about more about how we treat them as a congregation and looking at them. So we're going to look at several points here that are brought out, principles that are brought out in the text to hopefully help us for when we do see that opportunity coming up. The first one is that we need to address our attitude. Look in verse 17. It says, let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. So this is what this is about, is esteem, to how we view them as those people who are leading the church. It says that they should be counted worthy, that we should esteem them as worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. And so you might say, well, why would an elder not labor in word and doctrine? Well, that's a really good question. But I think it relates to the fact that sometimes elders would be they might have employment. They may have a job. This may be kind of something they do in their spare time. And others I've worked with a lot of elders who were retired, and they are at a point in their lives where they could actually spend all of their time in doing the work of an elder. And they might spend their time in teaching and preaching and doing classes and all kinds of things like that. So what he's taught, that's the especially part. That doesn't mean that if they're not doing that they shouldn't be honored. That's not the point. But here he is talking about how we should see them in our own minds. Okay, so there are a lot of passages related to this. There are a couple in Hebrews, but Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 7, it applies, in my estimation, applies to more than just the elders, but it certainly applies to at least the eldership. In chapter 13 and verse 7, it says, remember those who rule over you, or the ones who are leading you, who have spoken the word of God to you, whose faith follow, considering the outcome of their conduct. So what he's telling us to do is to remember them, to think of them, to not only consider them as people, but also consider the outcome of what they are doing. So we're hoping that we can help encourage good things to come, right? So the elders are the ones who are going to help lead a congregation and bring us to a point where we're growing and we're abounding in the work of the Lord. And this is something that the eldership will be not directing, not telling, but leading in, because that's the work of an elder. You know, we kind of talk about, there's a little bit of a joke going around that, deacons deek and elders eld, and everyone else does all the work. That's not how it is in the New Testament. The leaders of the church are the leaders. They are actually out front, holding the banner, going out and doing the things that are meant to be done. Now, there's only so much time, sure, and so there have to be restrictions, just like with anyone else. But when we are starting to put in men as leaders, we want to put in men who are leaders, not just men who have a title and directs people. So that's really what he's talking about here, considering the outcome of what? Their conduct. Not their teachings necessarily, although that is important. It's the conduct that we are looking for. So we're thinking about what is going to be the end result of how they behave, and to remember them and to think of them who have spoken the word of God, and to follow their faith, because if we consider the outcome of their conduct, we should also have similar conduct, so we'll have similar outcomes. Now, if we're looking at someone and they're behaving in such a way that we see that their conduct is going to present or produce something that's not good, obviously we are not going to be following that. But if we see their conduct is producing and will produce things in the future, that's the conduct that we should follow. So we need to have the right attitude toward elders. The eldership they're not God. They're not angels. They're not apostles. They don't dictate doctrine. They lead. And we have to see them as that. And if we can do that, then we're going to have a lot better time in the growth of the church. There also, if we go back to 1 Timothy chapter 5, there's a section here about how we deal with issues, right? Look in chapter 5, verses 19 through 21. He says, "Do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality." All right, so what he says here, first off, is there's rebuke that's coming in. What he says here, that's from verse 20, those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all. But he says in verse 19, do not receive an accusation against an elder from 2 or 3 witnesses, except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, this is Paul telling Timothy. Why would he be receiving accusations about elders? There are a lot of reasons that could be in play here. One, it could be that they have an eldership, and Paul and Timothy, people come and he's the preacher, so people come to Timothy and complain. Well, elder so-and-so did this. I think he's wrong. And generally speaking, when we're telling something about someone else that's bad, the reason is because we just want to discount them. We want to hurt them in some way. It could be that we want to take them out of the leadership. It could be that we want to have other people start to be suspicious of them, because if they do, then their leadership is diminished. And when that happens, then the leader really has a hard time leading, right? So if people don't, what happens is the esteem of the people go down. So he says, do not receive an accusation. That is, do not accept when someone tells you an accusation against an elder unless there are 2 or 3 witnesses involved. Why is that? Because anyone can make an accusation. You can make up something about anyone. In the old law, it was always established with 2 or 3 witnesses. It's interesting when they had a penalty or a law that was broken where the penalty was death. It could only be enacted if there are 2 or 3 witnesses. And interestingly enough, the witnesses were the ones who had to throw the first stones. That guaranteed or helped to guarantee that the people making the accusations weren't just making it up. And so Paul is telling Timothy, don't even listen to them if they say, and then he tells them, if you look at what he says in verse 20, those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest may also fear. There's actually a couple of ways of looking at that. And I don't know which one he meant. Maybe he meant both. If someone comes and makes an accusation, and there are no witnesses to it, that's sin. That's gossip. And so what do? You rebuke in the presence of all, so that the rest will not sin. But what happens if someone comes and they have an accusation against an elder and there are 2 or 3 witnesses? What do? You rebuke that person, the elder who has sinned, in the presence of all. Why? Because he's the leader. I'm reminded in the book of Galatians how that it was Paul said that he had to rebuke Peter to his face, because when he was in Antioch, when Peter was in Antioch, he was just fine being around Gentiles. He would eat with them, no problems, no difficulties between them. But when certain men came from Jerusalem to visit Antioch, Peter started pulling away. He started pulling away from the Gentiles out of fear of what these Jewish people were going to say, that he was going to offend them, or he was going to do something that they would consider to be wrong. And so he actually pulled away. And it got so bad that other people were starting to pull away from the Gentiles. And even Barnabas himself, the one who is called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, he himself even started to be pulled away from the Gentiles. And so Paul, looking at the situation, he sees that Peter's influence has spread throughout the congregation. He stands up and calls him out in the middle of everyone. I think Peter was probably pretty embarrassed by that. But it was necessary because of who he was and the fact that it needed to be said. So this is what we have. And he also tells them to have, so that's the 2 ways of looking at it. One, if that person is sinning, call it out. But secondly, if the elder is sinning, it needs to be called out. It needs to be dealt with. I've seen congregations where elders did wrong and nobody said a word. Oh, there's the elders, right? We can't say anything about them. We can't really bring it up. We're afraid we're going to split the church. Or maybe it was brought up and it was just kind of, we'll take care of it. And it was kind of swept under the rug. Those kinds of things can't happen. It has to be public. Everyone needs to know what's going on. And not necessarily public as in out there, but in here. We all need to know, right? And then he says that, in fact, it's a basically taking on the verbiage of a vow in chapter 5 and verse 21. I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. No partiality toward them. It's not that an eldership would ever that we shouldn't give them benefit of the doubt, just as we would any human, any normal person. We should, but at the same time, we can't be partial to them and say, oh, well, they're an elder, they're a leader. We can let them get away with stuff. In fact, the Bible teaches that the more you have been given, the more is demanded of you. So we actually should put them at a higher standard than we would a normal, an average Christian, because they're expected to be leaders. So don't show partiality. Don't allow people to just do whatever they want to do. That's what he's saying to him about how we should treat the eldership. And then this, of course, this really applies to any of us. You know, the church and many any organization would be much better off if they never received an accusation about anyone except for the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Doesn't matter if they're elders or not. If someone came to you and says, oh, you know what so-and-so did, stop them right there and say, okay, where are the other witnesses? Why are you telling me this? Is there some reason that I have to know this? If you stop them in their tracks and ask them, what's the purpose of them telling you that? They may have a legitimate reason. It's not that we can't ever say anything about anyone. There may be a legitimate reason for that, but asking them will force them to tell you what the reason is. And they might just say, well, you know, I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't say anything. That's good. That's the way it should happen. Matthew chapter 18, 15 through 17 tells us when someone sins against you, you go to them alone. You don't tell everyone else. You don't go on Facebook and talk about it. You go to that person and you work it out. And what happens if it doesn't work out? You bring 2 or 3 witnesses the next time. And there's a process. So we have to go through that. So this is how he tells him to deal with the issues that come up. And, you know, here's the thing. When we finally get elders in here, there are going to be issues. There are going to be problems, especially at first. That's the way it works. And it's never going to be perfect, right? Oh, you know, I have no thought in my head that we're going to be able to shift from going to a men's business meeting to an eldership with no problems everything's going to be hunky-dory, everything's going to be great from now on. That's not how it works. We know it's not going to happen. The men who are put into the office are human beings, whoever they are, right? And so we have to keep that in mind. And there are ways that we have to handle things. And openly discussing and talking with each other is the best way to handle them. And then he talks about the appointment here in verse 22. He says, do not lay hands on anyone hastily, nor share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. When I first read this, when I was a teenager, it says that do not lay hands on anyone hastily. I honestly thought he was talking about fighting. But that's not what he's talking about. Laying hands on someone is how they would pass on authority from one person to another. And actually, it's interesting, the relationship between a preacher and elders, because while Paul was certainly an apostle, he had the authority to do all kinds of things that the elders wouldn't have authority to do. But he had appointed elders, but he's telling Timothy, and he's telling, actually, in the book of Titus, he tells Titus to go to the whole basically the whole island that he was on. He wanted to have elders in every city, and Titus was to go appoint them. And so what they would do is they would go, and we can see an example of this in Acts chapter 6. And the example in Acts chapter 6 is of them, while they're having a problem, there's people who are widows who have been neglected in the daily distribution of food. And there was a complaint that rose. Now, these are not elders that being put in, but they chose 7 men. And so we have kind of an example of what they did in the first century that's good for us. So he says, Peter and the apostles told the people, look among you and find 7 men, and he gave qualifications for those men and said, present them to us and we will appoint them to the task. And so that's what they did. And so they chose those 7 men. I have no idea how they did that. I don't know if it was a vote. I don't know. But I do know that they presented them to the apostles, and the apostles laid their hands on them, and that was simply a symbolic gesture of their culture. More than likely, they put it on their hand on their head, and made some kind of a charge. And that then put them in the service that they were doing. That's the same thing he's talking about laying on hands. So he says here, do not lay on hands on anyone hastily. What does that mean? You don't just run into it, right? You take your time and make sure that these people are going to be sound, that these people are going to be accepted, that these people are going to do the job and function in the proper ways and actually be the leaders that we're wanting them to be. I've said it before that there's no such thing. You don't become an elder by becoming an elder. Just like you don't become a deacon by becoming a deacon. You are already showing the characteristics of a deacon before you become a deacon. It's the same thing with an eldership. Before you're an elder, you're already eldering. It's already a part of who you are in practice, because if you wait until you get there, how do we know if we put someone in if they're actually going to do the work? We don't. But if we see that they're already doing it, we already know if they're going to do it or not. Maybe on a bigger scale, yeah, but we can tell. So do not lay hands on people hastily. We shouldn't be in a process, and I don't want to be in a rush. But we have to balance that. So what do? We do not lay hands on anyone hastily. And then he says, nor share in any other people's sins. And that's an interesting one in phrase. He says, keep yourself pure. Sharing in other people's sins is, there are several things that we could say, but I want you to look in Numbers chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, because this is an illustration, and there's actually probably a better one with Korah. But this one actually relates to the leadership that was already established, and this would be Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Aaron already had a leadership capacity. Miriam was already leading a prominent woman in Israel. You can see that after they crossed the Red Sea, and she takes women and she has a song, and she's kind of a prophetess at that point. So anyway, they're important people, and they come to him. It says Miriam and Moses in verse 1 spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. They didn't like this. They said, hey, This isn't right. So they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken also through us also? And the Lord heard it. All right. Now, this is incidentally, the context where it says, now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who are on the face of the earth. There's a reason for having said that, but the point here is that Moses was the one that God spoke through, that Moses is the one that God appointed to be the leader, and the other ones decided they're going to step in and say, it's not just you. We also should have a say in this. Korah's rebellion was the same way. You remember what happened to them? The earth opened up and swallowed the whole tents and everybody, right? So this is a situation. This could be what he's talking about in 1 Timothy chapter 5 about not sharing in other men's sins. If that's the case, I want to think about it. There, in one sense, it could be not sharing in the sin as in, if you're hasty in appointing people to the office of elders, and biblically speaking, that would be what I do, because that's how it works. That's what Timothy was supposed to do. That's what Titus was supposed to do. The preachers can, and that's what I was saying before. That's an interesting interchange between the elders and the preacher, because the preacher is one who's supposed to anoint, for lack of better terms, to get the eldership started. That's what Timothy was told to do. That's what Titus was told to do. But then we also have the fact that elders oversee even the preacher. So there is an interesting relationship that's there that's not always easily figured out in how things work in a congregation. And most elderships and preachers, they understand that. They know there's some weird things going on there. And they have to figure out for themselves how to make it work. But that's not the point. If we hastily run into this, it could be that we're appointing men who shouldn't be in. It could be then that we're participating in something that's even sinful by appointing them to be leaders. That could be what he's talking about. But it also could be this coming back to the idea of laying hands on people and the process that's involved with it. Usually when elders are installed, and I've never been in a congregation that had elders installed. There was one church where I went where right before I came they installed elders, but I've never seen the process. Most people haven't. It's either they have elders or they don't, right? And they're usually, sometimes they have elders and then they lose the elders, but it doesn't usually happen where there's no elders and then they're added in. That's the ideal, but it doesn't always happen that way, and it doesn't usually happen. But anyway, when that process is going through, the only way that it can be done is if the people are in agreement. There's no way that I or anyone else can come in to a church and say, okay, I want you and you to be elders, and just appoint. That's not going to work. It has to be in full agreement with the church, or at least the majority of the church, right? And so we've always done that. In a congregation you may have been a part of that had elders, and they wanted to add more elders. What do they generally do? They're going to be asking for people to submit names. And then generally what will happen is they would take these names and pray about it and decide for themselves if, hey, should some of these be out? Sometimes that happens. But then they would present the names to the whole congregation and ask them questions, dig in, find out about them, see if you would be okay with them being an elder. And then when that happens and everyone's in agreement, then they're kind of presented back to the elders and say, okay, here's the ones that we think would be good for eldership. That's generally how it works. And the process, like I said, it's really kind of up in the air. Depending on how we could do it. But that's what we're saying. And what would happen in that process if you come up if someone stands up and says, I don't want so-and-so to be an elder because he doesn't meet these qualifications, and he just lists them off. Would there be anything wrong with that? Absolutely not. That would be good. We don't want people who don't meet qualifications. What if he stands up and says, the man meets every qualification in the book, I just don't like him? Is that a qualification? No, it's not. And so this could be a reference to sharing in sin, is opposing people from being the leader that God wanted them to be simply because of reasons that are not appropriate. Now, I'm going to be the first one to tell you that 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1 do not list every single appropriate reason that someone should be considered to be an elder. There are other things to factor in, but we've got to be careful, because none of us, and myself included, none of us want to be in a position where we're standing between a man who wants to lead and God, unless there's good reason. If there's good reason, then we should stand in the way. But if there's not good reason, if there's not biblical reason or principles, we have no right to stand in the way, because what we're doing is we're hurting the church as a result of that. So that doesn't make it any easier. It kind of complicates things even more, but it is something that we have to consider, and this is part of the appointment. And I think it's important for us to think about these kinds of things. We're looking at the future. We're thinking about what it means to have elders and how we're going to approach it. And there are a lot of things that have to be discussed, and I'm looking forward to talking about them more and more, because this has got to happen. The more we grow, the more we need elders. And in some ways, we're hindering ourselves by if we're not pursuing that to some degree. It's got to be something in the future that we're looking for. And if we're not pursuing that, we're actually hindering it, because God has set it up for a purpose. I don't know very many congregations that function well, larger than us, that don't have elders. In fact, I don't even know if I know of any that function well without elders, because God has set it up with a plan and a purpose, and we ought to be able to follow it. So that's it. Now, I recognize that this is not really a lesson designed to convict us of sin. Nobody in here could possibly sin against our elders, because we don't have any, right? And it could be, though, that you have things in your life that you realize you need to make changes in. And if that's the case, we want to help you. If you need to repent of sin, let us know. We can pray with you and pray for you. If you have need to be baptized for the remission of your sins, we're here for you. We'll be glad to help you with that too. If there's anything that we can do to help you in your walk with God, please let us know, and please come as we stand and sing.